I chose to begin this phenomenology series with propositions, but it would have been more appropriate, phenomenologically, to present them through an intentional analysis. I began with the propositions as I assumed it was easier to present them just as propositions, so I could explain a few phenomenological concepts. To produce each proposition, something must be intended in such a way that the proposition will be articulated. A proposition is in some way related to our intentionality, and that connection should be made visible. This will be clearer later when I describe the intentional analysis for the rectangle text. Almost all of the aspects of a rectangle text were made to fit into a hole that should look beautiful. Numerous statements testify to this. I will give some such examples later. It's actually quite surprising that an intentional analysis never has been made for the text phenomenon. It seems like the most obvious thing in the world. It's a phenomenon that seems very well suited for such an approach. This suggests that the cultural sedimentation must have been incredibly strong. It has just not been possible to intend the text in such a way. The rectangle text was so strongly sedimented that it could not be done. As you now understand, all this phenomenological activity does not happen during a single reflection. It happens during several years in an intermittent process in which you must go in and out of the phenomenological attitude and back and forth between the reductive phenomenological approach and the expansive phenomenological approach. For example, when you are focusing on clearing the larger spaces, you cannot focus on the line changes. It takes several months to finish the larger spaces, and you cannot proceed to the line changes until they are ready. In a rectangle text, the improvement of line changes could not be intended. They could almost not even be made as the column was too narrow. In a cluster text, when you have intuited and expanded the proper line length, sentence spacing, and alignment, the perceptual line changes are obvious. There will be some dangling words to the right that seem out of place. You will intend and move them immediately, and thus you have already begun improving the line changes. When you have improved all the perceptual line changes, you will be able to read a cluster text really well. And as you read, you will intend the other line change possibilities. They will be presented to you through your intentionality. They will be seen, or rather experienced. But those line changes, the linguistic, constitutionistic, and aesthetic line changes, are more difficult to manage. They are not as clear. When you read, you may experience a few problems and ponder whether they can be resolved. As you also understand, most or even all of the propositions can be seen as a result of an intentional analysis, i.e., as a result of a certain intentionality. You will intend certain aspects, and then you can try to variate and ideate them. You attempt to doubt them. Before the cluster text, nobody talked about cluster spaces, sentence spacing, and perceptual, linguistic, constitutionistic, and aesthetic line changes. We did not even talk about thumb space, no bent text space, note space, or fold space. Before, we talked about harmony, and so on. We talked about word spacing as it changes on each line so that you can produce straight margins. The straight margins decided everything. It made us read narrow columns and talk about 66 characters as an optimal line length. Furthermore, the column was so narrow that you could use a wide variety of typefaces. In a cluster text, with a line length of 95 characters, you cannot use a typeface that is too tight. If you do, you must increase the letter spacing. As you now have realized, through the cluster text, we will be able to intend, through an intentional analysis, a number of aspects that we couldn't before. I thought this was easier to understand now, after the propositions, and that is why I waited to tell you about it. The phenomenological method can be seen as an intentional analysis in which you pay attention to essences. Occasionally, they must first be intuited and then experienced and expanded to be able to appear. If you don't imagine and experience the proper relation between sentence spacing, line length, and alignment, all the essences will not appear. You cannot intuit them. You cannot intend them in consciousness. They cannot be presented to our intentionality. They cannot be given to consciousness. Now we can say that cluster spaces, i.e. the 5-space sentence spacing, the 95 character line length, the left alignment, the perceptual, linguistic, constitutionistic and aesthetic line changes, the thumb space, no bent space, note space and fold space, all are essences of a cluster text. They must be present to be able to experience the text phenomenon as a cluster text. The phenomenon cannot be seen without them. It cannot be intuited. It cannot be experienced without them. We cannot go to the thing itself, to the cluster text itself, without them. The phenomenon cannot appear without them. Hence, they are essences. This has been shown phenomenologically. It happened through an intentional analysis. Now you can use your intentionality to see this. Now it's easy. Before, it was impossible. Your consciousness couldn't make the cluster text available to itself. Now it's the easiest thing in the world. It happens every time you do it. It's apodictic and evident. It will be shown again and again every time you try. What also should be clear right now is that we are trying to intend as many aspects of the object as possible, and that we are doing it through our body. Through the cluster text, we are expressing a fuller bodily relation to the object, to the text phenomenon. We made our body appear as a reading body in the text phenomenon. Before, our body was almost exclusively understood as a gaze that thought beauty was important. A contemplative gaze took possession of the text object and made it look beautiful. That is almost exclusively how the rectangle text was intended, and because of that, readers had to push themselves through the text when they read it. They had to make an effort to read. Reading is hard work, many stated before. Before, our body was not seen as an active body that wanted to do something as efficiently as possible, that wanted to read as efficiently as possible. The text was not seen as a tool for our bodies. Heidegger was wrong stating that our original position is that we see things as tools, i.e., that we are practical. The text was not seen as a tool. We didn't improve it in that way. It was seen more as an artwork that should look good. Heidegger was also wrong in his later thinking when he thought that truth will be given to us in a better way through an artwork. The rectangle text shows this. It could be seen as an artwork that concealed truth. It's quite easy to see that we didn't see text as a tool. You will read a left-aligned text a little better. You will read a text with a sentence spacing of 2 or 3 spaces a little better, and so on. This is easy to discover if you read such a text for at least 2 days, and even easier if you will read it for a week. Possibly it's not as easy to discover this in tests only a couple of minutes, as in science. In all this, I've also tried to show that we can try to relate different intentional structures to pay attention to something concerning a phenomenon. We can try to intend associations between different phenomena to see if they matter. Seeing a text as an extension of our body and trying to relate it to a structure common to many tools could possibly make us pay attention to something important. As you now understand, we could have begun this phenomenological inquiry with an intentional analysis. Thus, you probably also understand that we can start doing phenomenology in different ways. It's mainly about getting into the epoche. We must start a reduction, which often means a variation process. and that can happen in a variety of ways, not rarely haphazardly. Sometimes it just happens. You just begin, as I did when I read Foucault. It's good if you can imagine different entrances to phenomenological inquiries. Opportunities concerning texts could have been to imagine ourselves reading and using a text and try to imagine what happens. Of course, we could also have looked at someone else reading and using a text. We could even have used advanced equipment such as eye movement cameras. Another opportunity could have been to make a descriptive intentional analysis of an already existing text, such as an ordinary book, an ordinary rectangle text. I will give such a description later. By starting from such a description, it could have been easier to produce variations and ideations, i.e. to produce alternative text to challenge the already existing one. It could be beneficial for you to jump back and forth between what I mentioned before concerning the propositions and what I am mentioning now about intentionality. You will probably be able to see a certain intentionality a little differently if you think about it starting from some of the essences and propositions. I could have mentioned all the essences once again, but that will cause a lengthy and awkward presentation. It's probably better if you infer some of the essences when you think about intentionality. You can move your eyes, your visual perception, at different spots in a text and see what proposition that could be connected to it at certain moments. What we should try to do in a full intentional analysis is to be really meticulous and rigorous and describe what is happening when we are reading or imagining a text, i.e. when we are intending the text in different ways. For example, what happens when we look at it, when we grip it, when we are looking for something, etc. We should pay close attention to our stream of consciousness, and especially to our visual perception. But we should also pay attention to other bodily functions, i.e. to other perceptions. In the intentional analysis, we should still use parenthesizing, variations, and ideations. To attempt to doubt something could mean that we try to see something as a problem. As you now have noticed concerning text, there are many problems that have not been attended to. As humans, we are adaptable. That is one of our main features. We adapt to our environment. Often, we should not adapt ourselves as much. Often, it would be better if we would have changed an activity or even a whole practice, such as text and reading. Now, I will also tell you a little about how an intentional analysis could have happened for the text phenomenon. Before, when a text was placed before us, we started by looking at it. As we did, we easily began commenting on its looks. We said that the ordinary rectangle text looked harmonious, beautiful, and so on. We intended text in a special way. We used our intentionality in a special way. If we would have been knowledgeable in phenomenology, we could have registered our comments and parenthesized them. Actually, we should now try to put the intentionality when we are looking at a text in an almost eternal epoche. We should not use it very much to constitute and construct a cluster text. We could make a cluster text a little more beautiful, but it should never interfere with our reading or use. Before we began to read a text, we could have tried to use the text in different ways. We could have paid attention to our thumbs. If they cover some text, we have to move our thumbs many times. If we had taken a look at the inner margin, we could have seen if there was any bent text close to the spine. We should not read any bent text. We could also have seen if there was any room for notes. If there was such a space, we could have been attracted to use it. We could also have seen if there was some unnecessary white space. Often, there is a large white space at the bottom of a page. Its aim is to make the pages look good. It could be unnecessary. We could also have seen if it was possible to easily find the page number. Sometimes they are centered at the bottom on the pages, making them more difficult to find. We could have parenthesized all such problems and tried to see if we could find solutions to them. It would have changed our perception and it would have changed our intentionality. Altogether, it could have changed our bodily experience of text, and thus the text as a phenomenon, i.e. as a text related to us, as a text relation. As we would have begun reading, we would have encountered a heading in most text. In some books, headings are centered, often because they look good. They would produce a symmetric page. But our perception needs to move an extra distance every time with such a heading. We could have tried to intend all such problems for our perceptual activity when reading. As we would have begun reading a paragraph, we could have found that our intentionality must constitute meaning. By assuming that our perception wants to get an optimal grip of the text, we could have wondered whether that happens when we are reading a text. We know that our eyes use many saccades along the lines, and we could have wondered if they are optimal. If we would have paid close attention, we would have noticed that we always should start reading a new sentence with optimal grip, whatever that may be. If we would have assumed that our sharp vision is quite small, we could have thought that we always should start and end reading a new sentence in an optimal way. And when I say assumed, it means that we would have produced a variation. It's not an actual assumption. It's a possible variation with a possible ideation. We could have tried to change the text in different ways to accomplish this. We could have seen whether it would have changed our perception and intentionality. For example, we could have changed the sentence spacing so that the center of our sharp vision always would have ended up perfectly in every new sentence. As we would have begun reading, we could possibly also have noticed that the right margin is straight where we change lines. This is obvious. Once again, we would have noticed that the further aspect in the text was made to look good. At some point, we could have realized that almost everything on an ordinary page or spread has been made to look good. Thus, we could, at some point, have wondered whether we could have produced a text in which all aspects would have been made so that we could read well. We could have realized that there could be a chance that we could have made every line change so that it would be better to read them. Our intentionality, with its perceptions, is different for different readers. In many areas, in different sports, for example, advanced athletes use different equipment. In pole vault, Armand Duplantis, as he runs faster, uses a stiffer pole than his competitors. We could have realized that an advanced reader possibly could have used a different text compared to slower readers. If advanced readers would have tried to read longer lines, they could possibly have found out that they are as good as shorter lines of about 60 characters. There is an upper limit, and it could have been where we are forced to turn our heads, or when it's awkward to turn pages. It would have been quite annoying to turn our heads at every line change or to turn to white pages. All in all, we could have tried to reduce errors if we would have considered what happens in our stream of consciousness and with our perception as we read and use a text. That could have caused us to produce variations to test them. If parenthetical references were used, i.e. if no footnotes were used, we could have noticed that we need to turn pages a lot. That is quite annoying. As you see, it would have been quite easy to find many errors in the ordinary text through our descriptions of what happens as we read. If we would have started from the acts of consciousness and the acts of the body, we could possibly have constituted another phenomenon. We could have constituted and then constructed a better text for our active stream of consciousness and our active streams of perceptions and bodily movements. If we would have tested different aspects and managed to produce a cluster text, we could have found that the longer lines will create a better flow during reading. With fewer line changes, our reading will not be interrupted as often. The cluster spaces cause us to always land our visual center at the fourth letter in each new sentence. And when we begin reading a new sentence, there will be no regressions, or at least fewer regressions, to the former sentence. It could also cause a clearer constitution of meaning. As every line change would have been improved, there would have been no saccades that only fixate a single word to the right. We would also have noticed that it's better to read certain parts of sentences that are closely linguistically in one sweep. For example, we wouldn't have needed to read single words on the line above that linguistically are closer to the following words. We could also have affected the constitution of meaning a little by moving some words. With more words on every page, we need not turn pages as often. This is also true with the use of footnotes. Altogether, we would have produced a much better reading experience. We would thus have been closer to the text as a proper phenomenon. We would have come closer to the text as a thing for us. As all the margins could have been made for reading and use, we would not have to move our thumbs. We would have found the page numbers more easily in the top right corners. We would never ever read any bent text. There would have been room for a fold at the bottom margin, and we could have taken important notes in the top margin. There would have been better affordances on a text page, as it would not have been made only to look good. All this could have happened before if we would have begun intending the text in a certain way and proceeded with descriptions of all the relevant aspects. It did not happen until now. Now you will realize that there is a clear intentional difference between rectangle text and cluster text. The intentional structure is different. Our intentionality is different concerning the two text types. You cannot see them in the same way with the same intentional structure. By what I now have mentioned, I hope that you will understand a little more of the intentional analysis as a method. You need to pay careful attention to what happens in consciousness through its intentionality. If you do, you could enable yourself to describe what happens, and that is the goal in phenomenology. As we now have seen, reduction is a term that Husserl uses to indicate a reflective inquiring back into consciousness. It's an interrogation conducted by consciousness into itself. The phenomenological reduction is closely linked with the epoche. That is how we begin. It changes our natural attitude. In the eidetic reduction, we brought forward the essential properties, the essences of the cluster text. A cluster text is not a cluster text without them. Now we can wonder whether it's possible to use a third reduction, a transcendental reduction to pure consciousness, to a pure ego. Husserl tried to develop a further reduction, a reduction to a pure transcendental ego. It started as a hyper-reduction in which he tried to reduce everything, the whole world, so that we would end up only with the structure of consciousness left. If it would have been left, the pure structure of consciousness could have been studied. We could have let it appear. But this is impossible. When you try that move, you will get rid of the whole world. And consciousness without a world is no consciousness at all. Husserl tried a variation, and it showed that the essence of consciousness is that it inhabits a world. The world is always already there. This also means that we can only talk about a world, and thus not an internal or an external world. There is a world which presents itself to consciousness in different moods and such. The reduction to a pure ego is troublesome. This we also understand through text and reading. The ability to read changes consciousness. It cannot work in the same way without that ability. Our brains change. We change. If we reduce that ability from consciousness, it will not function as it does with it. and we want to know how phenomena appear to people who can read. This can be seen as if the content of consciousness structures it. This also means that consciousness has such a structure that it enables it to learn how to read. This is shown by the actual ability and not through a pure consciousness. To try to describe pure consciousness could mean that you describe how it must be, its being, what must necessarily be the case for it to be able to accept a certain content. For example, there must be such a structure that the cluster text is better than rectangle text, if that is the case. This we learn from the actual content and not from pure consciousness. To see the structure, the will must be in it, so to speak. If the cluster text is an ideal text, the structure of consciousness is such that the text is ideal for it. In this, I'd rather like to call consciousness a mind body. The mind body is such that the cluster text is ideal for it. It's the content, the experience of it, that shows this, and not pure consciousness. In my view, we understand consciousness better when we get to know how it learns at its best. Reading text, adapted to how we learn and understand, at 500 words per minute, could be a good way to understand more about it. It's about how it acquires its content more easily. Even though this third reduction is troublesome, we can allow ourselves to be inspired by it. We could try to reduce consciousness to an almost pure ego. We can imagine that we are emptying consciousness, but leaving our new phenomenon, the cluster text. We could reduce or parenthesize most of the world down to the cluster text. If we do, we can then try to expand from that phenomenon. This happens quickly. You could imagine books, magazines, newspapers, paper sizes, libraries, bookshops, bookshelves, bags, coats, jackets, tablets, and much more, such as whole educations, schools, other organizations, and workplaces being different. If all rectangle texts are wrong and cluster texts are better, a world based solely on the cluster text could be quite different. Think about this for a couple of minutes. It's ridiculous how fast you can see so much being so different. Consciousness goes berserk. Can you see it? Or rather, intuit it? As we now have seen, a possible world presents itself to consciousness. In this imagined world, it's easy to imagine different subjects, objects, and social relations. This alternate, ideal world, this world in consciousness, is much more apodictic. It unfolds every time you think about it. It could show that many scientific studies are wrong. It could also make it difficult to do research. You can investigate the present world in empirical studies, but would it be wise to do so? Isn't it better to try to start building this alternative world? This is also why some think that art and literature are better ways to truth, or that they show truth in a better way. The present world is not as true or real, so to speak. When you begin studying philosophy, some kind of realism seems obvious. It's the common sense alternative. But as you see, some kind of idealism is not unimaginable. The philosophical problems are indeed worthy of serious inquiries. Much science may be too realist and too empiricist. You will only know more about the present world, and not the possible world you could encounter after you have seen a phenomenon after a proper phenomenological reduction. Through the transcendental subjectivity, i.e., the transcendental ego, we could imagine a cluster text world. But this imagined world is not a mere figment of our imagination. It's firmly grounded in a phenomenon. This means that this imagined world, in a sense, is more real than the present world. This is also why Husserl's phenomenology could be described as a transcendental idealism. This imagined world could possibly also be used to transform the real world. It could be used as motivation. Certain motivations will produce certain objects. Do you feel it? If you do, the possibilities start to multiply. They can be expanded massively through our imagination. We can relate a thoroughly reflected phenomenon to many other phenomena and see what will happen. We could even begin to see ourselves as another person. If we would have read cluster text from a young age, we would have been different. We may not even be we anymore. We may already be about to become someone else. Our motivations may already be about to change. You may soon want to start reading and writing cluster texts. In this reduction, we will also notice that we are not alone. There is a transcendental intersubjectivity at the root of the transcendental subjectivity. We know that others are experiencing the object from their situation, from their perspective, that other mind bodies are active in the same world from a somewhat different perspective. We also understand that we cannot build our imagined world alone. We must cooperate. Thus, we must share our imagined world with others. To establish a certain objectivity, we must develop a certain intersubjectivity, as I am trying to do right now. I'm informing you about the possibility of another text, and at the same time, I'm informing you about the possibility of another world, about another objectivity. And now you can decide to act upon it. If you want to realize that world, you must also turn to other people. If we will make a charitable interpretation of the transcendental ego, we can use it as a tool within the phenomenological attitude. We could try to desediment all the cultural and personal layers, or rather, almost all of them. And if we get really close to the pure ego, we can add and subtract different traits from that point. For example, if we accept the cluster text in the almost pure ego, we can imagine different personal traits and relate them to that first nucleus of the transcendental ego and the cluster text. People are different. They are not identical. You're a little like me, but also different from me. These differences can be seen as variations that we can ideate and expand from. A cluster text for me may not be the same for you. This can be explored imaginatively with the transcendental reduction. We can reduce and expand from different traits. For example, from illiterates, dyslexics, average readers, and advanced readers. We could add the attribute dyslexia to the nucleus and try to expand it. If we do, we learn that we cannot know about this and that we need to turn to others. We also learn that the object may need to be different to be ideal for them. Here, as concerning most what I'm telling you about right now, I only want to inspire you to a certain reflection. Give it a couple of minutes and you will probably imagine a few different scenarios. You could try to go back and forth from the nucleus of an almost pure consciousness with only a cluster text and add different possibilities. From an almost pure ego with an almost pure text phenomenon, we can expand in a lot of different ways. The cluster text phenomenon is possibly building different structures of consciousness for different people depending on some relevant differences. If there is something uniting all of them, we would have found another essence, i.e., if there is something invariant. We could try to go back and forth to reduce and expand to find such an essence. What we will find is a mind body, a consciousness with a body which is already loaded with meaning. Consciousness without a body is not consciousness at all. This body could be different and affect how we experience the text, but having a body is in itself an invariant. If we use the idea of the transcendental reduction, we could possibly become fully unbiased, totally free of any presuppositions. But probably not. We should probably try to reach as far as we can, but it could be difficult to become all-knowing. We know that we could fail, but we also know that someone else could get us a little further. You could possibly find something that I have missed. In the transcendental reduction, we should be really careful. The phenomenon we inoculate at this stage will be deciding for the whole world that will be imagined. Thus, you may realize that you should take the cluster text and repeat this whole process once again. I had to start from the rectangle text, but you could start and attempt to doubt the cluster text. You must do it rigorously. If it's true, you may not want to abandon it. I'm also contemplating another kind of reduction. I'm calling it a lifeworld reduction, but it should rather be called a lifeworld expansion. In a reduction, we turn to consciousness, and in this case, I suggest that we turn to a future life world expanded from the reduced and expanded phenomenon from our earlier reductions. In a sense, we can use the Hegelian structure of being, non-being, and becoming. We started from a being, the rectangle text, ended up with the non-being, the cluster text, as it doesn't exist in the life world, and now we could hope that it will turn into a becoming. We could hope that the life world will turn into a cluster text world. This is a way to project our future. It's a way to build motivation. The way we imagine this future world could affect how we become active. In this, we must in orderly fashion parenthesize the natural attitude to be able to imagine another world. An utopia, so to speak. We could also start to relate our own being to this world. We could ask ourselves what we must necessarily do to stay true to ourselves. If we want something to be true about ourselves, we may need to do something special. For example, I almost saw it as my duty to bring this whole project to fruition. I had to do it. I also thought I had to do it in such a way that I would save myself and possibly enable me to do certain things in the future. If I could sell many books, I could possibly realize many of my ideas concerning learning and help many people. As before, I only want to give a short example. You can use this idea to try to imagine a future world in which you should be able to say that you are you in a way that you want to be. Soon, in a near future, you should already have done what you expected of yourself in the reflection. For example, you could imagine a life world in which you have experienced a cluster text in such a way that you know that what you say about it is true to you. If you are responsible for other people's learning, for example, if you are a teacher or a parent, you could imagine a world in which your students or children are reading cluster text and so on. I think you get the idea, even though I'm not expressing myself very clearly right now. This suggested life world reduction is leading back to an expanded life world in consciousness based on the phenomenon from before. It's about developing self-responsibility, which is an important theme in Husserlian phenomenology. It's about thinking before we act. Other reductions are also possible. I think Husserl wrote about 8 such reductions in Crisis. Others have also written about possible reductions. I have only given you about 3 plus 1, the phenomenological, which is a break with the natural attitude, the eidetic reduction, in which you form an eidos, the cluster text in our case, and the transcendental one, which is the most radical, and the fourth, in which you could project yourself to a future life world. If you read Husserl and others, you can learn about other reductions. I hope they will be more manageable through the reductions I have presented. What I am trying to do right now is to make you come closer to the text phenomenon. In order for that to happen, I thought I must convey phenomenology to you. This includes how you should approach your own subjectivity, intersubjectivity, and objectivity. I'm not interested in your preconceptions or prejudices concerning text. I'm not asking you what you think. I'm asking you to do phenomenology to be able to experience the text phenomenon appropriately. Soon you will understand why I think this is important. All this explains the difference between phenomenology and phenomeноtics. In some sciences, they have in different ways tried to regionalize phenomenology to do research, i.e. to do a certain kind of science. If you know about Amadeo Giorgi, Clark Mustakas, Max van Manen, Dan Zahavi, and other popular names, you know what I mean. They have all talked about this in one way or another. If you know about them, you have probably also heard about the division between descriptive and interpretive phenomenology. All the approaches within them are examples of so-called phenomenological analyzing methods, which can be used when you have gathered some qualitative data. They could be seen as misunderstandings of phenomenology. For example, any of those strategies could have been used to take interest in how people see text, reading, learning, etc. But is it phenomenology? I'm not so sure. As you now already know about my distinction between phenomenology and phenomeноtics, you will understand why I think it's better to see them as phenomenological methods. If they are used, you could be said to be doing phenomeноtics and not phenomenology. I am suggesting that this is a better way to talk about them. It's easier to understand and hopefully less mistakes will be made. As a phenomenologist, you should always try to be rigorous when you are talking about what you are doing. If there aren't any proper phenomenological underpinnings, we should probably not talk about what we do as phenomenology. It could be seen as phenomeноtics, which is a less rigorous way of investigating phenomena. In my view, that is. It could be seen as a second-order phenomenology or hermeneutics in which you take interest in other people's views, experiences, and so on. The methods are not a first-order phenomenology, but a practice of a second order. And such a practice that is not built upon a proper phenomenology is probably not a phenomenology at all. This should be clear from the text example. You can present a phenomeноtics of educational practices without a phenomenologized text, but not a phenomenology. Learning theory and learning practices need a much more thorough underpinning, a more thorough foundation. It's not enough to do so-called phenomenological analysis of ordinary practices from a lifeworld perspective without a cluster text. In phenomenology, you cannot only describe the natural attitude or experiences in the life world. You should discriminate much more between different experiences. I'm not critical, meaning that the phenomenological methods are wrong or that doing phenomeноtics is wrong. I just mean that they sometimes are too naive, too naturalistic and psychologistic, i.e. they are sometimes everything Husserl did not want science to be. They take too many things for granted. Still, despite this, some studies are relevant. But if a proper first-order phenomenological reduction is made, it could show that many such studies are not as relevant. The cluster text could show that many studies of different sorts have been wrong or irrelevant, but also that such studies may need to be repeated starting from the cluster text phenomenon. So, if you want to express yourself more clearly, it could be advisable to talk about such studies as if you are doing phenomeноtics. You are using different interpretations of different philosophers to interpret a material, which could be seen as if you are blending phenomenology and hermeneutics, and thus that you are doing phenomeноtics. You are not doing original phenomenology for sure, and you know that this is the case. I'm not even sure that qualitative researchers should use phenomenology in the ways it's often being used. It's possible that it would have been better to convey phenomenology so that people usually being interviewed could do phenomenology by themselves. It would have been more in line with the phenomenological spirit of rigor, carefulness and responsibility. It could have built a firmer foundation. As you probably understand, this is why I'm trying to convey phenomenology to you. I'm not doing a qualitative study from a phenomenological point of view. I'm trying to convey phenomenology to you so that you can do phenomenology on your own. Of course, this is more difficult, possibly exhaustive, but so it should be within phenomenology. It's easier doing interviews as nobody then needs to learn phenomenology, but it's possibly not even phenomenology. In such studies you could at least have taught one participant to do phenomenology on their own to be able to compare it with the qualitative study. It's possible that we shouldn't conduct phenomenological research on others. Instead, we should possibly convey phenomenology to them. This would lead to another intersubjectivity in which we must develop methods to convey phenomenology, something I am trying to do through this presentation. In such a case, we must engage people in learning in how to learn, how to read, and how to write. In this way, learning is seen as much more important. What also could happen by such a strategy is that the reported phenomenon could change. People could develop another phenomenon compared to what they would have done without such knowledge. I am hoping that you will be able to do that concerning the text phenomenon. In qualitative studies, with what I call a phenomenological research methodology of a Husserlian kind, it's sometimes stated that it pertains to the four necessary steps of parenthesizing, intuiting, analyzing, and describing, and that it has four characteristics. It is descriptive, you use some reduction, you try to reach an essence, and you take intentionality into account. In such a study, you mean that you turn to the lived experiences as they are lived and experienced by someone. If you are successful, you say that you will better understand what it means for someone to have had such an experience. That is the goal. As you now understand, through the text, you could do that concerning many experiences, for example, in education, without going to the things themselves. And that is why I call it a phenomenological research methodology, or phenomenotics. Through your view of phenomenology, and now possibly phenomeноtics, you need to consider how you should proceed. You must let them appear to you, and then ask yourself what you should do. Should you interview other people right now? It seems strange. I wanted that to come across. Of course, you should try to interrogate your own mind-body and the text through the text phenomenon. You could produce a description, but it need not be written. You could begin to communicate with others concerning the phenomenon and convey your views in such a way. To do that, you may need a proper experience, otherwise you may expand the phenomenon inappropriately. When we think that a proper whole, with its proper parts, i.e., a proper phenomenon, a thing itself, has presented itself to us, to consciousness, to our mind-body, we should try to experience it in a proper way. We should let it get its proper grip on our mind-body. In my opinion, I think you should read a cluster text for at least a whole week. If you do, I think you will change your subjectivity, intersubjectivity, and objectivity through the phenomenon. You will form other relations, so to speak. You will begin to see the text, yourself, and others differently. You will experience yourself differently, and possibly project yourself to the future differently. I want that to come across, and that it also can be seen as a part of the phenomenon. By that experience, i.e., a week of reading, I think you will be rigorous, careful, and responsible in such a way that you will prevent a few mistakes. It could, for example, change what you think about typefaces. In the future, you may not want to experience any typeface variability. You may want to read the same typeface almost all the time when you read books. You may not like that you have to readjust to typefaces for each text you read. Reading is a bit unprofessional compared to other activities. Carpenters use the same hammer for decades. They want to feel their tools as extensions of their bodies. It's possible that we should turn text into such a tool. The text should possibly feel as an extension of our bodies, and for that to happen, books can possibly not vary as much as they have done historically. Of course, it could be difficult for many to read for a whole week. At first, it could be enough with 2 days of reading to prevent most mistakes. You could test your 2-day span and compare it with your reading of rectangle text. If you do, I think you will change enough to become a little more rigorous, careful, and responsible. If you don't have the time to experience the phenomenon fully right now, you should at least read a cluster text for a couple of hours. A short test may not be enough. You should at least experience a few reading sessions. I should probably also make it clear that 20 minutes of reading may not be enough. It could be too little for your mind-body to adapt. Through such an experience, the phenomenon may not be able to present itself to you. It may not be given to you. If you decide to experience the cluster text, you should be careful about what you say afterwards. Whatever you will experience, it could be tied to your particular kind of subjectivity, to your mind-body. It could, for example, depend on your reading ability. You may need to improve it to take full advantage of the cluster text. It may not be that the cluster text is bad or not good enough. It could be that you just need to improve a little. You should also know that you could be talking about your relation to the phenomenon, to the object, and that you are not talking about the object itself. It's very easy to slip into objectivist discourses or narratives in which you begin to talk about the object. I hope that this is clear. The cluster text seems better to me, and I read at 400 to 500 words per minute in Swedish and 250 to 300 words per minute in English. It may not be as beneficial if you read at speeds lower than 200 words per minute. I don't know that. But it's such effects that you need to explore. To conclude, you should possibly say, for people like me, with the characteristics X, Y, and Z, the cluster text is so and so. You should not say, the cluster text is so and so. That could be too objectivist. By my complete strategy in this endeavor, I'm also trying to invite you to a certain intersubjectivity. I want you to check if I have made any errors. I am asking you to try to do it better. It could be seen as intersubjective corroboration. It seems too fantastic that I should have got everything right. I could be too idiosyncratic, and some aspects could be related to me and not the structure of the phenomenon or the structure of the experience of the phenomenon. In Swedish, I am an advanced reader reading at a speed that corresponds to 500 words per minute in English. It's difficult, even impossible, for me to experience whether the cluster text is better for someone reading at lower speeds. Another source of error is that I have been reading my own text. I'm not reading as fast in English, but in English the cluster text also seems better. But it's still my own text I have read. So by doing a proper experience and by doing phenomenology, you could help us to possibly get even closer to the phenomenon, to get closer to the thing itself. Through this presentation and my books, I have tried to fully explain what I have done and how I did it. I have tried to convey my presuppositions. It's possible that you are able to spot errors in my approach. If you do, you could possibly change the phenomenon. You could possibly change our subjectivities and objectivities emanating from the text phenomenon. At this point, when I am doing this presentation, I have written 4 books and produced a further book with cluster text in English, which you can use to further evaluate the cluster text phenomenon. In total, they consist of about 800,000 words, so you could read them for a couple of days even if you are an advanced reader. In 2024, I hope to complement the collection with a further book, Typographical Investigation, consisting of about 350,000 words. If you read all of them, I hope you will get a better grip of the phenomenon. I hope you will feel that the cluster text will become a better extension of your body than the former rectangle text. The more you use it, the stronger this will be felt. This cannot be felt during a few minutes of reading. As soon as I have translated typographical investigations, I will probably try to develop a way for advanced readers to test their week span. If you read at 500 words per minute, you can read about 250,000 words a day. If you're able to do that for a whole week, you need 1.75 million words. I hope this will be ready in October 2024, if everything goes well. Until then, you could read my books twice if you want a thorough experience. If you do, you could experience that the cluster text is experienced as even better during a second reading. By this lecture, I hope everything is clear about the text and why I'm doing this. It should now be clear why I think I had to try to convey both the text phenomenon and phenomenology to you. I want you to explore both. Now that I will continue, I am assuming that you could assume the cluster text as being better even though you may not have done a proper experience of it yet. It's as if you have had an experience of it. I am imagining that you have read it and found it better. By this approach, I can assume that you also are being in truth, i.e., that you can assume the cluster text as better. At this point, in May 2024, 6 books are available in Swedish. If you're interested, please buy them through Books on Demand. You can only do that if you live in Sweden, I think. If you do, you will support me a little extra. Thank you. I'm sorry if you feel that I'm a little self-serving now. It's difficult not to be that in my situation. I hope you can accept this. So, now, if we have experienced the text phenomenon properly, if we have experienced the cluster text properly, we can change our attitude and begin to see it as a theory. The first phenomenological step is thus completed, and we can leave the descriptive attitude and phenomenology to adopt another attitude. By what I already have mentioned, in this presentation, I wanted to show the pre-theoretical character of phenomenology. And as soon as we are arriving at theory, we are leaving phenomenology. Now we can do science, use logic, mathematics, and so on. When we have a theory, we could turn to science. We could, but should we? I will soon give my answer to that question. We could also turn to philosophy. If we do that, we could also see phenomenology as pre-philosophical. It could be easier turning to philosophy after an example of a phenomenological description. This is interesting in our case, as most philosophers and scientists have read and written texts. Thus, we could assess different philosophical views through the text phenomenon. Philosophers and scientists have expressed different views in different areas of philosophy. I will give a few comments on them, and they are only meant to get your thinking going. We could start by thinking about metaphysics. Metaphysics can be seen as a proto-philosophia, a first philosophy. Concerning the text, we have used phenomenology as our first philosophy. It could find a different text. Other metaphysical perspectives could not. Philosophers who used realism or idealism as basic perspectives did not find the text. We could wonder what that says about the perspectives. I will not do that. I'm just showing that it can be done. I'm just giving you a few short examples to ponder. We could also think about epistemology, the theory of knowledge. Philosophers have presented different views in epistemology. None found the cluster text. Were they not rationalist enough? Not empiricist enough? They were so close. Descartes used his radical doubt with pen and paper in his hand. He could have doubted the first object he saw, a text, but he didn't. John Locke sat with his thoughts on tabula rasa and an empty paper in front of him. He could have filled it properly through experience, but he didn't. You can think in this way concerning many perspectives. Thoughts in epistemology are interesting to our case. Texts are often the first objects used, and with a false text, many other results assumed to be knowledge could be wrong and false. We could also think about science. We could turn to the philosophy of science and the question, what is science? Through the cluster text, this question could be seen as quite puzzling. Are the wrong methods used in science? Are the wrong participants used in studies? Can you test text on ordinary students that haven't practiced their reading? You would never test golf clubs on ordinary students. Is it okay to continue using short tests? I think it's better to use 2-day spans or even week spans. By all this, we could continue the phenomenological tradition of criticizing psychology. We could also say that phenomenology is needed as a first philosophy to improve the foundation of science. There is much to say concerning science. I will give an incredibly short summary. With the cluster text, I am suggesting a new Lacatosian research program. We could be about to enter a Kuhnian paradigm shift. What we are trying to do is to falsify the rectangle text in a Popperian manner. And we could do all this in an anarchist Feyerabendian fashion. If you know about Lakatos, Kuhn, Popper and Feyerabend, you know what I mean. We can also think about ontology. Ontology is about what there is. Ontos is the Greek word for being. Heidegger posed questions about the meaning of being, but he couldn't problematize the being of text. In his later thinking, after dicere, his turn, he turned to text, but he couldn't change them. The formal ontologist, the phenomenologist from München or Munich, who wanted to go in a more realist direction in phenomenology, have expressed many thoughts on ontology, but they didn't ontologize the text. Different objects could be seen as having different ontological statuses. Mathematical objects, such as numbers and relations between numbers, are seen differently than, for example, a text, a reader, and the relation between text and readers. If we add two numbers, we will always get the same result. 2 plus 2 equals 4. If I would have asked you to answer what 2 plus 2 is, you would always answer 4. Every time. This is trivial. When people are asked to write a text, we get many different answers. It is as if 2 plus 2 sometimes is 4.1, 3.9, 3.6 or 4.4. It's probably seen as close enough to 4. There is a range of accepted answers to the text plus reader question, but this could be wrong. We should possibly be as rigorous as the mathematicians. There could be one exact cluster text that always should be used. In typography, we must possibly learn to see that text plus reader always equals a specific cluster text. For example, I'm suggesting that we always should use E.B. Germond in books. Always. And it should be used with all the other parameters I have suggested. It's possible that such a text, or a text very close to it, is the best possible text. You will get a specification of that text in a later lecture. In ontology, you could try to categorize objects in different classes. For example, subjects are ontologically different from objects. but different objects could also be seen as belonging to different classes. It's possible that text should be in a more rigorous class, i.e., that it should be used with more constraints, with less variability. In phenomenology, there is sometimes a certain relation between ontology and psychology. For example, through the cluster text we could have shown that some experiences actually are related to the object and not the psyche. The rectangle text caused certain psychological effects, but they didn't depend on the psyche. They were caused by the object. For example, teens are not lazy. If you teach them to read properly and give them cluster text, they will probably read more. It's the text and the undeveloped ability that were wrong. It wasn't laziness, which could be seen as a psychological explanation, not an ontological one. We could also think of ethics. Some said that Husserl got stuck in an old way of thinking. His kind of thinking turned out of fashion quite quickly because of its character. Some said it did because his phenomenology wasn't moral, practical, or existential enough. Husserl was said to focus too much on consciousness, too much on the cognitive, and so on. By the text example, you may come to realize that this, in a sense, is not true. If you're able to find proper objects or tools, proper and ideal things, so to speak, immorality is indeed involved. A cluster text constituted through a transcendental phenomenology could have enormous practical and moral implications. The cluster text is better to read, and thus we understand that objects could also be seen as moral. When you set an object free, you could also set people free, as subjects and objects are closely related. The relation between a subject and an object could also change the intersubjective relations between different subjects. If people actually had used Husserlian phenomenology instead of talking about it or criticizing it, they would have understood this. I hope you understand it now. The focus on morality through Husserlian phenomenology is a different way to think about ethics. If cluster texts are 20% better, they are probably morally superior. If you will continue using some kind of rectangle text or some other single-space text, you will be forcing your readers to read for longer. In a way, you will be stealing their time. You will make them less free. As long as people continue reading ordinary text, they will lose a considerable amount of time. In medicine, many try to add years to our lives. By the use of cluster text, we could get more time already from a young age. Furthermore, the cluster text could also be used to think about justice and equity. Is it just to make more money if you have a lengthy education even though you don't know how to read and write properly? That is just but one question. There are many more to ponder. We could also think of aesthetics. Rectangle texts were made to look good, and some books were made to feel good in our hands. Our hands and our eyes are dominant in many aesthetic considerations. Through the cluster text, we are releasing the possibility of another aesthetics concerning text. We will satisfy our eyes and our hands in another way. Aesthetics is often about beauty, about what is beautiful to look at and listen to. But aesthetics could also be about what is experientially valuable. Reading a cluster text could be more experientially valuable than to read a rectangle text. It feels nicer. We will not be as tired, and it could be easier to think as we read. There is much to say about all these areas. I only wanted to give you a few examples so you can proceed on your own. As we have seen, we can think differently about metaphysics, epistemology, science, ontology, ethics, and aesthetics. We will be able to think differently in many philosophical areas by starting from a phenomenological description. This can be expanded quite substantially. If you are knowledgeable in those areas, you are probably contemplating some such possibilities right now. Now we will turn to the phenomenotics of the rectangle text. I'm suggesting that there could be no phenomenology of rectangle text. If you use the phenomenological method appropriately, you would always end up with a cluster text. But since few have turned to Husserl and instead used other methods said to be phenomenological, they did not find the text. This explains a little how I think we can use the concept of phenomeноtics. People may have used different phenomenological methods to understand text and reading, or readers. This is true of every study in which text have been involved. In all phenomenological studies, you should try to phenomenologize the relevant objects, or rather their correlates in consciousness, their corresponding phenomena, so to speak. But instead of doing that, other methods have been used. When people earlier investigated the text or something close to it, reading for example, starting from the so-called phenomenological tradition, they did so by describing people's experiences or opinions. This is done in qualitative studies. In such studies you try to find out what people mean or what they think about a phenomenon or how they experience it. By some, this is seen as you are doing phenomenology. This is often done within the social sciences. As a phenomenon, rectangle texts carry meaning. There is a relation between the subject and the object. You could ask about it in such studies. I call that phenomenotics, as you haven't done any proper phenomenological groundwork. I could have described a common rectangle textbook and some opinions commonly expressed about it, but I will not do that. Instead, I will show a description. You have probably encountered many statements about such text. For example, that the optimal line length is 66 characters, and that readers could double read a line with larger line length. Another proposition is that the bottom margin is largest, because then the text looks as if it's resting on a white block. It looks good. Collectively, the rectangle text margin look good, and so on. Now you're seeing a picture of the object. The description of the phenomenon is related to the object. People's views of the text phenomenon produced such texts. A description of the actual text is not the same as a description of how such a text is given to consciousness or experienced by a mind body. It's not the same as a description of the phenomenon. But since there is a relation between the phenomenon and the object, it could be seen as if the object is derived from the phenomenon. With such a text phenomenon, you will produce such a text object. If one earlier actually had described how text is given to consciousness, or a mind body, when reading, somewhat phenomenologically, one would probably have described that we are experiencing it much like a video stream. We are not seeing or experiencing all the images from the saccades and regressions. We are only experiencing a flow of words or meaning. In a way, we are experiencing a double stream, what we are reading and our reflections. Furthermore, we would probably have described that we would be tired and must take pauses after 5 to 60 minutes depending on how good a reader we are. After those descriptions, we would probably have described how people comprehend the text, as you are often interested in questions concerning meaning in phenomenology. One example is Wolfgang Iser's The Reading Process, a phenomenological approach. According to his phenomenology of reading, when considering a literary work of fiction, one must examine not only the text, but the response it evokes in its readers. A text has an artistic pole, which is the text as created by the author, and also an aesthetic pole, which is the text as realized or responded to by the reader. This is but one example of how phenomenological researchers rushed into the text without phenomenologizing it, even though they used some kind of phenomenological approach. Many have expressed that ordinary spreads in books look beautiful and harmonious. This could be seen as the essence of such text. That is how consciousness wanted the pages to be presented to itself. As this was expressed so often, you didn't want to change the page in such a way that it didn't look good. For example, typographers hesitated to use footnotes, as they made a page look ugly. They are more pleasant to read and use, but still they are rarely used. Not even in the academic literature. The rectangle text, experienced as phenomenon, the essence of people's opinions about text, so to speak, is that it should look beautiful and harmonious. Despite all this, the common consensus, i.e. the discourse, concerning books, was still that texts were made to be read. That a text is a thing to be read has been expressed by many typographers. They also expressed that they always were thinking about the reader. They probably thought they produced the best text possible. They believed there was a perfect correspondence between truth and beauty. This is probably the deep philosophical core of the rectangle text. This is the assumption that rectangle texts rest upon. The natural attitude produces ordinary rectangle text. Books are seen as the best rectangle texts, but many worse texts are also produced. For example, in magazines and newspapers, line lengths of 45 characters are common. I am often calling ordinary texts rectangle text or single-space text. In history, people have been mesmerized by geometry. In antiquity, philosophers saw the circle as the perfect form. Concerning text, rectangles have been seen as the perfect form, but they were often placed on the spread by the use of circles. Typographers have used compasses to draw circles on the spread. Thus, both rectangles and circles were present, as in the Vitruvian Man by Leonardo, which could be seen as a prime example of that paradigm. Geometry can be seen as another essence of rectangle text. It's both text and experience producing. Many mathematicians love mathematics for its beauty, and geometry is the science of sciences for rationalists. It has been much the same for typographers. Beauty and geometry were essential to them. Concerning word spacing, the following excerpt could be enlightening. In the 19th century, which was a dark and inflationary age in typography, many compositors were encouraged to stuff extra space between sentences. Generations of 20th century typists were then taught to do the same, by hitting the spacebar twice after every period. Your typing as well as your typesetting will benefit from unlearning this quaint Victorian habit. This extract is from The Elements of Typographic Style, and through it we understand that single spaces can be seen as another essence in rectangle text in the 21st century. The single-space-ness is an essence that produces texts and experiences. You will expand from that thought. Double or triple spaces could be a few % faster to read, but still the single spaces were seen as important. Other possibilities were seen as quaint. Efficiency was not seen as important concerning single-space texts. Hence, the essences of beauty, geometry, and single-spaceness made typographers produce the ordinary rectangle text books. Now that we know about cluster text, we could say that our body is not as present in rectangle texts. Texts were experienced as cogitos almost without bodies, as thinkers with a contemplative gaze, who thought beauty was most important. Our bodies had to endure reading beautiful text rectangles. Such texts could be seen as mere artworks and not tools for reading used by our bodies. They are like paintings with the margins working as a frame. Typographers have often been inspired by artists, for example, Peter Mondrian and his colored rectangles. They were never inspired by craftsmen and their efficient tools made to suit our bodies. Even the earlier phenomenologists, or the phenomenoticians in my vocabulary, have seen our bodies as artworks and not tools. Sometimes our mind-body has been expressed as an I can, homo capax, but still they didn't try to find out what a mind-body can do with the text. In all this, we can say that people earlier were too empiricist and rationalist, too subjectivist and objectivist, and too realist and idealist. They were not relationist enough, not phenomeноcentric enough. They could not see how the subjects and the objects could have changed each other. Expressed in another way, people were not enough empiricist or rationalist, and so on. This could be summed up as people have not been phenomenological enough. The so-called phenomenologists were too phenomenological. They did not phenomenologize the subject or the object enough. They could not let the text phenomenon appear as they were interested in phenomena in other ways. As I see it, phenomenoticians think that you can turn to any experience and describe it as a lived experience. But phenomenologists must be more careful. We should handle phenomena more carefully. We could also perform an intentional analysis of the rectangle text. It shows the difference between descriptive psychology and phenomenology. By a descriptive analysis of the intentionalities at work in a present situation, we are not doing phenomenology, we are doing descriptive psychology, understood as an empirical science. The rectangle text was produced by typographers who looked at the text. It was not made by considerations concerning reading and different uses. If you read about typography, you will learn that they often decided to use all alternatives that made a spread look good. The obvious examples are the use of footnotes. They facilitate a much better reading, but typographers avoid them because they don't look good. There are further examples. In the 1800s, many used 2 and even 3 spaces between sentences. They are probably a little better, but since they don't look good, people were recommended to avoid them. This is also true of the straight right margin. It's probably a little better to read text with a rag, but it doesn't look as good. So typographers continued using straight margins. As you see, there are many such examples. Typographers looked at the spread as a picture. That is how they intended texts. That is how their intentionality functioned. They had trouble thinking outside that box, and instead they paid close attention to what looked good, and because of this they could not pay attention to alternative aspects. There are further examples. It's probably better not to read any bent text, but then the spread doesn't look as good, so they kept the narrow inner margin. A spread was also seen as better looking with a large white space at the bottom. Consequently, such a space was always used. Extra space was used in the only margin where it doesn't cause a better use, which it would have done in all the other margins. In rectangle text, all white spaces are made to look good. The visual perception, i.e., the visual intentionality, was used to produce a good-looking text. But when typographers talked about text, they said that the text was a thing to be read and that they were producing text for readers. Quite often, there was a large discrepancy between what was said and what was done. Everybody probably thought and expressed that they made text that were good to read, even though they always used the alternatives that made a spread look good. This exemplifies an important phenomenological lesson. In empirical studies with qualitative methods, such as interviews, it's sometimes stated that they do it on a phenomenological basis. They state that they are interested in phenomena. But is it possible to reach a phenomenon or an experience by talking to people? Are people doing what they are saying, or is there a gap that must be managed? Is the phenomenon something that can be expressed in discourse, or is it something else, more difficult to grasp, for example, that can be reached through what people are doing? Where do you find the essences? This is a further reason why I call such studies phenomenological studies, and that they are based on a phenomenological way of looking at things. Quite often, there is no rigorous reduction before such studies. In this section, we have begun an intentional analysis of the natural attitude concerning rectangle texts. We can also make an analysis of the text of the object and its way of talking to us. It could be seen as the talk that guided our intentionality and perception. It is as if a rectangle text says, "I look so good, look at me, look at my lines, they are so straight. I look so harmonious, you can trust me, beauty is rational." And as books, they say, "Grab me, I'm easy to handle." But possibly they also whisper, "Keep your distance, I'm a bit difficult to read." Many adults do not even read one book a year. We can do this also for a cluster text. It says, "Put your thumbs in my margins, there is plenty of space. Don't worry, there is room for a fold. Stay calm, I'm taking care of you. You need not read any bent text, and if you need, there is space for notes. I've already taken care of everything. Just read me, use me. I want to become a part of you. Get close, settle down. I will not exhaust you. You can keep going. You will soon be about to experience me as an extension of your body. We can achieve great things together." In this comparison, there is also an important lesson. It can be easier to understand a phenomenon through what it isn't. It's easier to understand the cluster text through the rectangle text, and the rectangle text through the cluster text. It's easier to express what is happening. If you know how mistakes are made, it's easier to avoid them. I hope this lesson will be remembered as you turn to other phenomena. It could even be argued that you don't fully know what a phenomenon is if you don't know what it isn't. Put differently, you don't know the intentionality at play if you don't know how it functions when it doesn't work. There is an interesting difference between the readings of Husserl and typography, i.e. how people intended the different books. When people, especially philosophers, read Husserl, everybody was critical. When the same people wrote texts and published books, they were uncritical and trusted the typographers completely. They just handed over their manuscripts. It would have been better the other way around. From this we could learn that different books are read differently. They are intended differently. We go about things in different situations in different ways. You have to think how you will go about things when you are doing phenomenology. You also have to think about how you will go about the text problem. Now, the phenomenon has appeared and we have thought more carefully about a few other possibilities. We can proceed. We can wonder what we should do next. I will talk about that in the next lecture.